War Room, Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room, Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to War Room Pandemic. I want to thank the team out in Denver. We had a slight problem. Of course, you've been watching MSNBC and CNN, even the guys that have hundreds of millions of dollars, right? The only thing we have hundreds of millions of dollars here is Raheem Ghassan's T&E, right? the Morton's bills. Actually, you've done very well in going through Morton's withdrawal.
I've got all the whole staff are over at my house just bussing my dining table
with Gomez Adams here. Okay. Want to thank everybody for making this possible. Back on FM 109, 103.9, 99.1 in Chicago. We're back up. John Fredericks Radio Network. We've pushed Dr. Ludwig so we can get him on when we've got this beamed out everywhere, hopefully momentarily. Or maybe the next segment would probably be best. Let's go back here. Jim Cramer, I think, was on our topic today. Was he not?
He was.
We have Brother Cramer?
I think what's going on in this country right now is there's just two different dangers that are being courted. There's the danger that just says, look, the United States is shutting down, and that's just not healthy, and it could lead to economic collapse, social unrest. And then there's another side which just says, listen, we got to have a plan to get open, and we're going to get a LabCorp thing, and we're going to have the great scientists of the world come up with something. So you better be ready for the good stuff. I wish it weren't so political. Because I really do think that when you look back, say, in the 30s in Europe, you say, why didn't they see that there was social unrest? What were they thinking? All these businesses were closing. Couldn't they tell? But somehow that's become a right-wing argument. Historically, it's a left-wing argument. So I say maybe it's a neither left nor right. It's about the notion of the center holding. And if indeed we have a good enough structure with medical that is ready, go for it.
No, it's not about the center. I think this. Look, I'm a right winger. Now, I do think that we ought to think through how we get this. I would like to see everybody's energies and how we get this open in a smart way, right? And I think we got to do that. But the right is nationalistic. We have to get back to understanding we're a nation, and we're a nation among other nations. We're inextricably linked economically. We're not saying we're isolationists. We're not. But this is why I talked on this interview I did with India TV today about how Modi is. I think Modi is fantastic. The largest democracy in the world. He's a nationalist. He made some tough calls. He's trying to keep the Chinese, the CCP out. He's made some tough calls even with us at first to say, hey, I got to make sure I've got the hydroxychloroquine. He was the first guy to say, hey, look, I got to make sure I've got 1.1 billion people. I'm not so sure my medical healthcare system is as good as you guys. I got to look after my own. I have no problem with that. Just like in Guatemala, you're going to shut your borders. I dig it, all right, if you think that's best for your people. But we've got to come through this smartly and tough, and we got to make sure we're engaged. Right now, this is the third world war, whether you like it or not. And I'm not saying China did this on purpose. I'm not saying they had a bioweapons program. We'll find that out in the days and months ahead. I'm not even saying it came out of the Wuhan P4 lab on the young technician that we can't find anymore, and the Batwoman who actually freaked out in late December, said, I hope it didn't come from my lab, from my program. I'm not even saying that. What I'm saying is that they absolutely knew about it for 6 weeks, and that caused the destruction, 95%. That's what they got held accountable for. But it's obvious in this crisis, the way these gangsters think, they're trying to exacerbate the problems, and they're trying to run the tables on this. I understand people don't want to confront this. It's tough to do. People remember, also just keep it in mind, historical perspective. With the rise of Hitler from 1932 and even all the stuff out of the 20s, the rise of fascism, we never declared war on Mussolini and Hitler. They declared war on us. Even after Pearl Harbor, people don't remember this. It was Pearl Harbor, and on December 7th, the day he lived in infamy was Pearl Harbor. He talked about declaring war on the Imperial Japanese Empire, right? It was 2 days later, Hitler and then Mussolini, because they had secret treaties with the Japanese, declared war on us. He ran, after 8 years of Hitler, Roosevelt ran with a pledge against Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was kind of the Donald Trump. They said, we've had enough politicians, that the New Deal didn't work. 1938 was a terrible year. You know, you had Father Coughlin, you had all these right-wing guys on radio, you had Huey Long, you had all these guys lighting all these populists, lighting Roosevelt up. There was not certain he was going to win in 40. Wendell Willkie was looked at as an outside-the-box guy, a Trump-like figure. Now, it turned out he wasn't a Trump-like figure, but the whole purpose was get a businessman because this is a disaster. You tried Hoover, right, that didn't work with the old Republican playbook. This new thing of government everywhere, these make-work jobs, the kind of the little bit of the Mark Cuban thing you're saying is not working. Let's try something different. Roosevelt promised, under no circumstances we're going to get back in a European war. This is just a continuation of the last one. It's their problem. And because why? Because America, we want to take care of what's here, right, and be left alone. Basically, that's how people want to live their lives, and that's fine. But sometimes the world intrudes on that.
Breaking poll. Got to share this. The Pew Research Center has this out. These numbers are just absolutely huge. 90% of Americans see growing Chinese influence and power as a threat, with 62% of those saying it's a major threat. The poll of 1,000 Americans found unfavorable opinions of China shared across party lines. About 70% of Republicans and 60% of Democrats holding them. In addition, the poll showed, and again, that's the 90% is a growing threat. This is a massive 20-point shift just since President Trump came in office. Now, of course, they tie it back to President Trump coming in office, not a global pandemic. That, by the way, you go and take a poll on China. I mean, they're not calling it the China virus for nothing. It's because
the reason he's president of the United States is the managed decline of the country by our Wall Street, our corporate, our cultural, our think tank elite that had this theory. It was called Thucydides' trap. This is Henry Kissinger and Graham Allison at Harvard. Okay, the same scam they ran back in the 70s about the Soviet Union. We're the declining power. It goes back to ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta, the rising power and the declining power, right? And we're the declining power. And the way the declining power is supposed to do it, and to avoid a large global conflict, is to basically, essentially kowtow, but to get to get your way by gently nudging them to kind of follow along and become a part of your order. And that way you'll be the junior partner, but the junior partner will actually control the situation. It's it's dangerous. It was dangerous in the 70s. A guy that came out and blew that up was a guy named Ronald Reagan. He goes, hey, how about this one? We win, they lose, right? They're an evil empire. He called them out. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And that was Ronald Reagan. Or as PG, the French infantry officer, poet, Catholic socialist poet, died in the trenches of Verdun. He said the most important thing is not to report what you see, but to see what you see. This is the difference in the signal and the noise. The American people, hey, guess what? The Pew poll, they're woke, okay? This is woke America. And as Sam Houston told the guys down in Texas before the Civil War, when the United States decides to do something, when you anger them, they get it done. Do not anger those guys, because once they get up on it, they get up on it.
You know, there's another point here. I mean, we so often think of the left as being the scooter riding soy boys. You know, crying into their I don't even know what they drink. Everything's an endangered species at this point. But there's another line in here with both the U.S. and Chinese economies reeling from the pandemic. The poll found that Americans recognize that the U.S. is the world's leading economic power and the world's leading military power. A significant majority, 91%, believe the world is better off with American rather than Chinese leadership. Here's the thing: it doesn't make the connect, though. Do people realize that we're right at the tip here of that no longer being the case?
I think they're going to become. I think because in their daily lives, I think it's going to hit upon them. Right. This is the Cuban America 1.0 and 2.0. Hey, I'm an America 1.0 guy, and here's why. America 1.0 had the three big challenges: the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II, the Great Depression of World War II. Eventually, America always, when it turns, it always makes the right decision, and it gets the job done no matter what the cost is. That's America 1.0. You know, maybe I want America 1.0 for this one. And we'll give you, hey, Mark, we'll give you. But he did bring up some good points yesterday. We have to start to compete. We have shipped over all the we've let the R&D go over. We've let the manufacturing go over. That's got to stop. That's the whole reason for nationalism. It's not racism. It's not. Look, the Chinese people, This is about the freedom of the Chinese people. They're the biggest victims of this. They're by far the biggest victims of this, right? It's their freedom. Whoever frees the Chinese people, or the situation of Chinese people, is who's going to write the history of at least the first part of the 21st century. That's obvious now. This pandemic just brought, like in any crises, it brought all the themes up into a, and you look, you know, Ben, this is one of the reasons I have Freddie Gray, the Spectator. The UK knows this better than anybody because the last big time, I guess the Cold War is when it happened with the United States pulling everything together. But the most dramatic was obviously in the 1930s with Churchill. And people don't realize that Churchill's all held as a god today. He was considered a nutcase. I had a guy the other day, a very prominent reporter, one of the smartest guys in town. He said, "Hey, Steve, the problem with your whole CCP is that it's going to take forever to catch on. People are not, it's not really a main theme. You see her on CNN." And he goes, it's not like World War II. I go, dude, you know that we never declared war on Hitler. He didn't know that. He goes, that's a good point. I never thought about that. I said, after 8 years, I said, we're doing fine. I said, we're doing fine. We're getting down there. People are getting woke because they just look around at their lives. And now you've had such dramatic things. I think one of the biggest dramatic things is not going to just actually be the sports. I think Passover and Easter will play, and when they look back at the history of this, the first time you don't really have a Passover, the first time you really don't have, in 2,000 years, don't really have a Easter, right? Okay, we're going to take hashtag War Room Pandemic. We want all your comments, all your observations. Particularly, I want your comments on Mark Cuban's yesterday. Tell me what America 1.0 is to you and what America 2.0 is to you. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Let's get some great commentary. We'll put them up. Cuban thinks highly enough about you. Don't give me snark and don't give me this is give us reflection. We're going to take a short commercial break. We'll be more with this discussion on geopolitics when we return.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to War Room Pandemic. We took care of our technical problems, so we're distributed now all throughout the world. Later in the day, subtitled in Mandarin Chinese, so I hope our world audience is there and seeing us. We are now live from Capitol Hill, the nation's capital, the United States of the Federal Reserve, as we call it, from Fort Defiance, episode 130. Over 6.2 million downloads on podcasts. So not only were we ubiquitous on Newsmax TV, on Dish Channel 219 with America's Voice, and all the radio networks of the John Fredericks and other radio networks throughout the world. But also our podcast is one of the top podcasts in the country and the premier podcast in dealing with pandemic because we take on the science, the public health, also the economic crisis that was triggered, and the financial crisis on top of that. We've been talking about the implosion in the oil and gas industry, and particularly the evisceration of the American oil industry. President Trump just tweeted out this morning, very different than yesterday at the podium. He's on it today. He's directed the Secretary of the Energy and the Secretary of Treasury come back immediately with a plan to save the companies in the oil and gas industry in West Texas, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, up the Marcellus Shale, and all the northern plains up in the Bakken. All of it absolutely vital to the American economy and the entire Trump economic plan. We're talking about geopolitics. The cover story of this week's Economist is China winning the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19, or as we call it, CCP virus. I was just on the Times of India channel today. There's Sean Hannity talking to, I guess, hundreds of millions of people and laid down. We're going to tweet that out. They're tweeting it out. I refer to the Chinese Communist Party as I walked through exactly the culpability here. And that's without a P4 lab problem, and that's without a bioweapons program. That's all to be determined in the future. But to help us think this through, because remember, one of the two aspects we do besides the pandemic, the economic crisis, the financial crisis, is the geopolitical considerations and what happens to American politics from that in your personal lives. Make sure you're part of the program at hashtag War Room Pandemic. Now I want to bring on Dr. Edward Luttwak, and he is the, I think, premier geopolitical thinker in the United States today. When I went to Georgetown back in the 80s, required reading and studying was his seminal work, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire. He has been an advisor to every administration. He's been an advisor to major corporations and one of the great thinkers in the United States. Dr. Luttwak, thank you very much for joining us today on War Room Pandemic.
Good day. I was listening to your introduction, of course, And it strikes me that you talk about the United States and you talk about China. Now, it was during the Cold War that was reasonable to talk about the United States and the Soviet Union, but it's not when you're dealing with China. Strategy is a strange thing. It's not straightforward at all. And if you look back on it, over the last 10 years, what we had was that during the Obama administration, for various reasons, China was doing various expansionist things. They were grabbing little islands, paving them over, building up bases, and the United States was then otherwise engaged. That is, the Chinese were acting. They actually converted a lot of coral reefs and shoals and islets into bases in the South China Sea. And the United States government at that time did not even complain on environmental grounds. They actually destroyed huge extents of coral reefs. I love snorkeling, so I was quite aware of it. And I was quite annoyed that the White House, Obama White House, did not even do that. So what was the paradoxical result? Strategy is paradoxical. The paradoxical result was that instead of the Chinese winning, what they did was they turned Japan away from a neutralist drift to becoming tougher and tougher in resisting China. India, at the beginning of this process, under then Prime Minister Singh, was not even responding to Chinese border crossings. India becomes more and more aware of the China threat. The Indians start straightening up their military organization in the frontier areas. And eventually Modi comes to power, also because of the feeling that India has to really respond to and react to China. Because in Japan, there was a Prime Minister Naoto Kan. In India, there was a guy called Singh. Neither of them wanted to react to China. They said, oh, who cares about these things? We have other fish to fry and so on. Instead, both in India and in Japan, you have strongly governments that make themselves stronger, make strengthen alliances with the United States, build up their own military forces, and become very vigilant about Chinese intrusions. Then, of course, Vietnam was there all along. In Vietnam, they told me 10 years ago, they said, well, you know, the Chinese are very good at making things. They work pretty hard. They make a good plate of noodles, but fighting is not their thing. When they invaded our country, we fought back. Nobody helped us, certainly not the United States. That's back in 1979. The U.S. considered Vietnam its enemy, and we fought all by ourselves. We repelled them. We killed a bunch of them. They withdrew. They never came back. So the Vietnamese, the Japanese, who were drifting away, become strong U.S. allies. India becomes from neutral or anti-American, actually starts being anti-American, then neutral, now is every day more an alliance. I don't mean all of India, but for example, the Indian Navy, which is growing quite well, the Indian Navy works with the U.S. Navy every day more closely than other non-official allies. India is not an official ally. Then you have a country like Australia, which was doing huge business with China, and then even bigger business with China. And along the way, the Australians say to the Americans, what about putting 1,000 Marines in Darwin? Darwin is the extreme north of Australia, is the Australia everybody should visit because it's the real one with crocodiles and buffaloes and every car is a four-wheel drive with a tube to cross over Billabong. Great place. 1,000 Marines. The Australians, who are doing big business with China, suddenly asked the United States, what about stationing 1,000 Marines there in Darwin just to encourage our Indonesian friends? Now, what about Indonesia? That's a country that is not like Japan, which was already a strong ally, or India, which has a sense of itself being more and more important as it grows and becomes less poor. No, Indonesia was a country where it was really a very passive attitude to external threats. Suddenly, the Chinese are so provocative and so threatening about the claim on the offshore, Indonesian offshore. It's called the Natuna Island offshore, where actually Exxon, the U.S. company, has a big gas operation. Chinese suddenly claim and say it's ours. The result of that is that even Indonesia sends helicopters to this island with missiles, anti-ship missiles, and even Indonesia, not a very aggressive country, announces that if the Chinese intrude, they will be met with anti-ship missiles launched by the helicopters. Now, in other words, the Chinese are autistic. The Chinese do not understand a foreign policy. They never had a foreign policy. The country is so big, so complicated, so busy with an earthquake here, a flood there, an epidemic in the third place now these days. All of this that the government pays no real attention to external affairs. Their foreign ministry doesn't report anything back, and if they do, it's ignored. They are purely propagandists. The Chinese ambassador, his job is to be a propagandist, not to listen to what Americans are thinking or saying. So they don't get feedback. They are acting autistically. Therefore, they turn Japan from a country going neutral into a country really militant against them. They turned India, they turned Indonesia, and now comes Malaysia. Now, Malaysia have many claims to fame, but there are definitely people who enjoy their afternoon nap. And they get up late in the morning, they go to bed after lunch, then they get up just in time to be able to go to bed again. So what did the Chinese do? having claimed the Malaysian offshore waters as their own, right, as part of this modest claim for 3 million square kilometers of the South China Sea, the Malaysians didn't respond. They didn't react. So what did the Chinese do? They were forced to send a warship, have a TV camera there while Chinese naval officers are pointing to a map and saying, this is our water and this and that. And they broadcasted on CCTV, Chinese television, the foreign language edition in English. And they broadcasted 4 times. Finally,
Dr. Luckman, I just want to make sure for our audience, explain the South China Sea is one of the most important waterways in the world, right through when the Straits of Malacca comes in the South China Sea, one of the most important, huge body of water. Walk people through when you said they militarize it by taking these coral reefs and turning them into basically stationary aircraft carriers. Talk about their claiming it as an internal sea that is 100% their property.
Right. So the Chinese are a land power, and they fundamentally don't understand naval power. Naval power is not about being anywhere fixed, but it's about controlling the whole space. So what do? Since they are expansionist, they are in the process of trying to expand the Chinese empire. What they are doing is all of the vast ocean. Visualize the map of China is a kind of round thing. China is round looking to the Pacific. All around this round, there are islands. And most of it is geographers called it the South China Sea a long time ago. And it's 3 million square kilometers. And that is the water east of China, which then you have a chain of islands. You have, of course, Japan. Below Japan, you have Taiwan. After Taiwan, the Philippines. Philippines get very close to Indonesia. Indonesia continues and wraps around to Singapore and then touches Malaysia. All of that vast water enclosed by this chain of islands is the South China Sea, or it's called the East China Sea. East China Sea, the northern part, South China Sea, the other part. And suddenly the Chinese government pulled out a sketch. It's called the 7-dash line, a piece of paper that a Kuomintang, that is a pre-communist civil servant had written more or less by hand. He'd do the sketch. It's the kind of sketch that somebody would do in fourth grade. It's a fourth grade sketch. And he put on it little markers and said, this is ours. At that time, the government of China, the Kuomintang government of China, did not control most of China. It controlled almost nothing. They had no navy to speak of at all. They had a few fishing boats, and they totally didn't control any of this. In fact, when the Filipino government 50 years later challenges this at the international court, the international court looks at this case and say, well, this is at least, we have all these impossible cases. This is at least a simple one. The Chinese
Dr. Luttwak, we're gonna take a short commercial break. We're gonna return. We got to sell some commercials here to pay for this. We're gonna return in a second and finish up with you. Dr. Edward Luttwak, geopolitician, will join us. Tweets too much of the VOA and now immigration. I support all. They're all fine, but you do that in a more organized effort, right? We got to go after WHO and going after the CCP. Voice of America is clearly a disaster. I think Politico is going to have a story up later. I've got a couple of lovely quotes about Amanda Bennett. The Liberate thing, we understand people are frustrated. They want to get on with this, but there's an organized effort to do this.
I thought the tweet last night was fine. I think this is, look, when we're at a moment when President Trump is getting attacked for supposedly not shutting the U.S. down soon enough, for not doing enough to close the borders, for not doing enough to keep the coronavirus out and not having proper screening and the concerns that go around that, when our national economy is on the ropes and people are losing jobs and we're doing everything we can and pumping all this money in. I mean, you opened the show saying we're the United States of the Federal Reserve. This is the moment where temporarily, until we can go and get our economy back, till we can make sure that testing we're in a good place, till we have both the containment and the mitigation aspects of this.
I agree with that 100%. But do you send that out at 11 o'clock at night, or do you do it on the podium today in a power move to say, you walk in and go, hey, here's my power move for today. Bang. Here's why we're stopping all immigration. By the way, here's the executive order I just signed. Here's the reason we're doing it.
I like it. Drop it last night. Have everyone run around with their hair on fire today. Then come back to the podium today and say, here are the details. Plus, by the way, here's my energy plan. And on top of that, those tankers that are coming from Saudi, hey, guys, turn around. Do
you think he does that power move? You think he turns them around? Here's the problem with our refineries. We actually need part of that. Remember, we can only run so much on our crude, right? We do need foreign crude.
And also, refineries are designed around the input. So if there's a refinery in South Texas that's designed for Saudi crude, it has to take Saudi crude. That's just the way it works around the world. It's sort of why the French were so interested in taking out Libya, because all of the refineries in Marseille are set up to take Libyan crude oil.
But I think with the Saudis, here's the broader point is that, to me, yes, obviously we have this goal of being energy independent. We were, and now things are a little bit in chaos. But this was a concerted effort between the Saudis and the Russians to go and take it to the U.S.
Do you think that is now, why is that now not top of the list of what people are talking about? Well, the reason we had Dr. Luttwak on, we realized Dr. Luttwak's not the guy you bring on Hannity for a 3-minute hit, right? He's a deep thinker, but he really understands the material. It's very important, we feel, for the deplorables to start to get coached up on this, right? Why is no one in this town? Two things they're not talking about. These numbers right here, you're starting to see the Rubios and the Hawleys, and obviously Cotton guys have been hawks for a while. You're starting to see this, but you haven't seen the basic political culture in this town, and particularly even the political media has never been this hardcore as the American people. American people are taking leadership because they're seeing with their own eyes. But on the Saudi-Russian thing, it's absolute crickets. Until President Trump, you and I talked yesterday. He came out yesterday, and it was not. I didn't think it was the press conference about the oil. If I'm an oil and gas guy, I wasn't feeling good. Hey, if I can buy close to a zero, I'll buy as much as you get. That's not what I want to hear. How we get the price back up to 40.
That's why this morning's tweet was so important, saying that there's going to be this strategic plan. If you're an oil and gas guy last night, you're freaking out after the press conference. Let's just cut right to it. You're like, holy smokes! I need to get in this food line. I'm being serious. I'm not like throwing out hyperbole. This is like, this is end of days. That's why we need to. What I want to hear today at the briefing. Look, we don't need to spend a whole bunch of time on the immigration part, because that's essentially.
I think he does. You don't think so?
Because I don't think as much. I think the energy part is much more important for what.
Yes. But you do agree that he's got to come out and do power moves on both, though.
Oh yeah.
Interesting thing about the immigration, you remember he already had an agreement with Trudeau and the president of Mexico to limit cross-border immigration. The Border Patrol came out yesterday declaring, I think it's 7 items that will, rationales for why you cannot cross the border, why you can. They left out room for agricultural workers, people who are necessary for the American economy. But you also have to remember that about a month ago, they stopped accepting visas at almost every embassy in the U.S. because we pulled back all of our non-essential employees.
Well, now they're going to jam up the green card, all of it. Nothing's going to go. This is not just about visas coming over here, at least temporarily. They're locking down the entire system, right? I think it's obviously good. I've been a restrictionist because I think we ought to maximize citizenship here. I like the fact that we're taking in immigrants all the time. I believe in the meritocracy, the merit system, and I think that President Trump's made a good move. I hope I would go in depth today to explain, okay, short commercial break. We get back. I don't know if we're going to have Freddie Gray or not because it looks like we're having some technical problems, but that's okay. Try to work through them. War Room Pandemic. Go to # War Room Pandemic. We want to hear your thoughts, particularly about yesterday's Mark Cuban interview about America 1.0, America 2.0, and give us your thoughts on Dr. Luttwak. We're going to have him back as soon as we get the technical problems sorted.